For those filing in now, we've opened the webinar space just a little bit early, and we'll get started just a little bit after the hour to let folks file in.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I see that people are still connecting and getting into the webinar. So thank you very much for joining us today. I'm going to start with brief introductions. My name is Yvonne Smith-Tapia, and I am the Senior Director of Programs and Impact at the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh. We're very happy to have you here today. We have great speakers that we're going to talk about a very interesting topic, and we are hosting this event in partnership with the Stimson Center. We will share in a minute more about their work. Clint, just let me know if I should start now with the program as we plan it. Perfect, great. So thank you so much again for joining us today. I'm happy to introduce you to Dr. Work, who is going to moderate the conversation today. Dr. Work is a fellow with the Stimson Center, jointly appointed to its Security for a New Century program and 38 North. Prior to joining Stimson, Dr. Work was an assistant professor at the University of Utah's Asia campus in South Korea and the regular foreign policy writer for the Diplomat magazine's Korea's page. He holds a doctorate in international studies from the University of Washington and a master's in international relations from the University of Chicago. And his work focuses on the Korean Peninsula, US-Korean relations, East Asia, and US foreign policy. Dr. Work, we're very happy to have you leading the conversation today with our great speakers, so please take it away.
Thank you, Yvonne, for that very nice introduction. Sorry, I'm messing with all the bells and whistles here, the perils of virtual programming. And thank you also to you and the entire World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh for your partnership with Stimson and its 38 North program. And just very briefly, some brief background for our audience. The Stimson Center is a nonpartisan think tank in Washington, D.C., dedicated to enhancing global peace and economic prosperity by identifying pragmatic solutions to current and emerging global challenges. And 38 North is a program of the Stimson Center and a website devoted to providing policy and technical analysis on North Korea. I will provide links to both Stimson and 38 North in the chat box. Today's webinar is part of the Stimson Center and its 38 North program's outreach on Korean peace and security issues. And the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh has been a wonderful partner in bringing together a really nice and diverse array of people from in and around the Pittsburgh area. Now, as the title suggests, today's program aims to foster greater understanding about US-Korea relations. But before introducing our two speakers who will help us do so, I want to point to just a few salient connections between Pittsburgh, the state of Pennsylvania, and Korea. First and foremost, 2,401 Pennsylvanians gave their lives during the Korean War, and thousands, if not tens of thousands more, have been stationed and served in South Korea in the 7 decades since the war. In fact, Pittsburgh's own General Matthew Ridgway commanded the U.S. 8th Army and later all multinational forces under the US-led multinational United Nations Command, or UNC, during the Korean War. But there are other important non-military connections as well. The state exports roughly 1.66 billion in goods and services to South Korea, which makes up about 11% of its exports to Asia as a region. and has helped create about 9,000 jobs in the state. Multiple Korean companies invest in the state, which has helped create over 1,500 jobs. In 2018, there were over 2,800 Korean students studying in the state. And quite importantly, almost 50,000 Korean Americans call the state of Pennsylvania their home. And also for the sports fans or fanatics among us, the Pittsburgh Steelers' former Pro Bowl wide receiver, Hines Ward, and I believe MVP of Super Bowl 40, if I'm not mistaken, is half Korean and was born in Seoul, South Korea. He's considered something of a national treasure there, and I'm sure in Pittsburgh as well. So in sum, there are many important and enduring links between Pennsylvania, the US, and the Korean Peninsula. And we've got two outstanding speakers to help us further explore some of this relationship. First, General Walter Sharp served as the commander of US Forces Korea, United Nations Command, and Combined Forces Command in South Korea from 2008 to 2011. Furthermore, beyond his command and professional experience in Korea, General Sharp shares a very personal bond with the place. He was born while his father fought in the Korean War. Beyond Korea, General Sharp has commanded US troops in Iraq, Haiti, and Bosnia, and held important positions at the Pentagon, including as the director of the Joint Staff. Moreover, until recently, he served as the president and chairman of the Korea Defense Veterans Association, or KDVA. We are very grateful to General Sharp for joining us today, and to KDVA for their wonderful partnership in our ongoing outreach and programming. Next is my great colleague, Jenny Town. Jenny is a fellow at the Stimson Center and also the deputy director of 38 North. She was named one of Worth Magazine's Groundbreakers of 2020, 50 Women Changing the World, and one of Fast Company's most creative people in business in 2019 for her role in co-founding and managing 38 North. In addition to her research on North Korea and US-Korea relations, Jenny has experience in track 2 diplomacy with North Korean officials. So she brings a wealth of insight to today's conversation. The format of today's program is as follows. The speakers and I will have sort of a semi-structured conversation for the first half of the webinar. Then around the half-hour mark, we will turn to audience Q&A. We have disabled the chat function, but the Q&A box is open. So as you have questions as they arise, please post them there and we will queue them up for the Q&A session. I also want to note that we are going to pose our own polling question to you, our audience, later on in the Q&A session to get a sense of your collective sentiment on some of the issues. Just to be clear, though, it is an anonymous response. It just tallies the overall numbers. Okay, well, with that said, I want to turn to our first topic of discussion, which is North Korea. And I want to direct the first question to you, General Sharp. And that is, currently in US-North Korean relations, we're somewhere between the so-called fire and fury of 2017 and the hopeful and even historic diplomacy of 2018 and early 2019. Where do you see events trending in the coming months and even years? And as best we can tell, what are North Korea's intentions? And what complicates and hinders Kim Jong-un and North Korea's calculations and policy decisions?
Thank you, and thanks to the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh into the Stimson Center and 38 North for hosting this. As Clint said, I served in Korea from 2008 to 2011, but have stayed involved with Korea and strengthening everything that I can do to help strengthen the Korea-US alliance while I was there and since then. And in my role as the chairman of Korea Defense Veterans Association, that's what we really push for. So the opportunity to be able to talk about the importance of Korea, the importance of the alliance, and what's happening in Northeast Asia, I really appreciate this opportunity. So thank you. To your question, Kim Jong-un, his main goal is to have his regime survive and total control over his people, but it's regime survival. Now, I believe that Kim Jong-un understands that in order for his regime to, he believes that in order for his regime to survive, he has to have a nuclear capable force that would deter anybody from even considering attacking and taking out the regime of North Korea. So that's number one. Number two, though, is I do believe that Kim Jong-un understands that as more and more information gets into North Korea about how poor their economy is, how badly compared to the rest of the area human rights is in North Korea. I do believe he believes that in order to be able to maintain that control, that ultimate power in North Korea, that somehow he's got to work through to get the economy to move forward. And so where does that leave us now for the near term? I think I personally believe that he's in a wait and see mode to see what happens with our election here in another month or so. I think he completely understands that under President Trump, there's not going to be any reduction of sanctions, which would help him economically and militarily. There's not going to be any reduction of sanctions unless he would really give up some of his nuclear capability, which I don't see happening. So I think he's kind of waiting to see what happens with the election. If Vice President Biden gets elected, I think he will go at trying to convince him that maybe by doing small things, but with us giving sanctions relief to be able to help their economy move a little bit forward, I think that may be where you go. With President Trump, it may be just the opposite. If President Trump is reelected, it may be just the opposite, that he will try to force it through provocation, some sort of, another nuclear test, another ballistic missile test, and then come back and really try to push the region and the world to be able to start reducing sanctions that are there. But the other, I guess the last part of this is you really never know. The people who guess what Kim Jong-un is going to do over the next months and years, we're usually wrong. And I think we got to always remember that, always be prepared for provocations, always working towards deterrence, but do that as we move forward. And if you look historically, when a new president comes in or changes administration in the United States, North Korea has tested them, and they've tested them with provocations. They've tested and to be able to say, okay, you have to reduce sanctions, you have to give us more economic aid and more guarantees. So I think that's where I see us heading. It's not clear with depending upon really either president comes forward, but the longer term is his goal is maintain his regime, reduce sanctions, be seen on the world stage as a global power, and to be able to just totally control the people and, as I said earlier, regime survival.
I want to turn to my colleague, Jenny Town, essentially with the same question. Jenny.
Sure. Thanks, Clint, and thanks again to the Pittsburgh World Affairs Council for inviting me today. I think this is a very important and timely discussion. I agree with a lot of the points that General Sharp made, but I'd like to take a little different angle on it, give it a little bit more nuance, especially on the domestic North Korea front. I think we have to understand, Kim Jong-un's calculus here. So even before COVID-19 hit this year, Kim Jong-un had signaled before that he was going to refocus on internal and domestic affairs. In his December 2019 speech, he discussed how he no longer believes that better external relations will lead to greater economic opportunities in the near term, on one of the things that General Sharp discussed, needing that economic development. But then he refocused his objectives for 2020 to be really on strengthening the domestic economic institutions to be more resilient to a persistent sanctions environment. So COVID-19 then really accelerated this inward focus with severe anti-epidemic measures, including closing down the border, causing major unforeseen and extended economic disruptions to the country. Now that they've been hit with multiple typhoons and floods as well, which are exacerbating an already difficult year. So in this kind of environment, Kim's focus has been on domestic affairs, epidemic control, leadership changes, managing economic expectations, tightening their belt again, but also trying to build morale through these difficult times. They're ready for this, they're prepared, they're able to do this. But the rhetoric also shows that the North Koreans no longer believe that quick solutions are possible, as much as they may have seemed possible back in 2018 at the Singapore summit. So with that, as General Sharp said, they're not in a rush to get back to the negotiation table with the US or with South Korea for that matter, because that optimism that those relationships can change is gone. Instead, they seem focused on their domestic situation, essentially going about their business for right now, waiting to see what happens with the election. They have left the door to diplomacy in the future, left the door open for diplomacy in the future, leaving room for either a new administration in the US or new signals from the Trump administration that a different offer is on the table. Leaving that possibility open and hoping that that new offer or different offer is one that better resonates with both their security concerns as well as ours, as they feel like their voice has not really been heard in this process.
Jenny, if I just make a point or maybe ask you a question, where do you feel with more information getting into North Korea, and because of where they stand economically, I mean, forcing people to buy bonds and to be able to give some money, directly to the government, where do you see the possibility of unrest? And I know that's almost unthought of in North Korea, but we did see a little bit when they devalued their money several years ago. And the struggle that I'm working my way through right now is with all the information getting in, is there a possibility that will force Kim Jong-un to do some things to better the lives of the people of North Korea, which I think he would say, yes, I've got to work on it internally, but I think even he understands that won't get him to where it needs to be in the long term for his 26 million people up there. I was just wondering what you thought from your perspective on information getting into North Korea and the effect of that, if any.
Yeah, I think you're right. There is a lot more information. There's also a lot more business. And since Kim Jong-un has been in power, he's really tried to raise the expectation of economic prosperity, not just survival. And this was a huge leap from what they had before. And because of that, expectations were high. He had mentioned at the beginning of his rule that the North Korean people shouldn't have to tighten their belts again. So this does create a really difficult situation for Kim Jong-un now. And what you see is that the image that he's tried to cultivate domestically is to be more like his grandfather, a man of the people. You see him out with the people, you see him smiling, you see the iconic picture of even the soldier on his back, right? You also see him being more accountable to the people. He does acknowledge when goals aren't met. He does apologize on occasion, because I think he did see in the past in 2000 in the currency revaluation in 2011, I think he saw that the one time that the people did push back was when you mess with the money. So this is something that he's very conscious of, that again, now, like I said, he is trying to build and maintain that domestic morale that they can get through this, that we're going to build better institutions. You see a real focus on holding managers accountable for their piece of the puzzle here. And you see even in like the construction projects, when he's given site guidance, he's very careful and very strategic to praise the workers and scold the managers if things aren't the way he thinks they should be, or if things need to change. And so he's really cultivating that social construct between him and the people in a very careful way, and now has the task of reducing that expectation of economic prosperity quickly. It's going to be longer term, you're going to have to suffer. And so you see him trying to give signals that there's things that he's giving to the people, like the hospital and some of these other projects, as a morale booster, that we can do this, we can survive on our own.
I could continue to listen to your conversation back and forth, but I do have a question I want to turn to. There's something General Sharp alluded to, the possibility of maybe further tests to get maybe a second Trump administration's attention and bring the US back to the negotiating table, which raises the issue of potential escalation on the Korean Peninsula, which is an ever-present issue. It's an ever-present issue, yet we haven't had an actual conflict or second Korean War in over 70 years. I mean, during these periods of escalation, like in 2017, we often hear US policymakers say that all options are on the table, but there's always considerable pushback to the idea of actually using military force against North Korea, despite its rogue behavior. Why do you think this is? And are military options or responses to North Korea's WMD ambitions or provocations really a viable solution? General Sharp?
Right. So the short answer is yes, there's all kinds of options that are on the table that many of them we would never want to take, but if forced into a corner, we would. And what I'm aiming to go all the way to, if we believe that the potential of a nuclear strike was about to happen, we have options that could deal with that. And so do the South Koreans. But to the broader question on escalation and provocations and all of that, if you look at, so I was there 2008 to 2011. 2010, everybody knows that the Jongun was sunk and YPO was struck by artillery. Those were kinetic in both cases, kinetic provocations from North Korea. And in both cases, South Koreans were killed, and in the YPO attack, South Korean civilians were killed. Out of those attacks, but especially the YPO, the second attack that happened in the latter part of 2010, the South Korean people became very, very clear that they're not going to stand for this anymore. They're not going to stand for North Korea threatening or killing any South Koreans. And so the people, and I mean across the board, and I think this still holds true very much so, said that if North Korea ever does a provocation again that kinetically or kills South Koreans, that the response going back into North Korea is going to be very, very swift and very, very strong. A whole set of plans was developed after 2010 called the counter-provocation plans, which looked at a whole range of scenarios of North Korean provocations and was agreed to between the United States and the Republic of Korea as to what would be the responses. Keep in mind that if a provocation happened right now, whether it's some artillery being shot on an island or some cross-border firing at the DMZ, whatever that provocation would be, that it's South Korea that's going to respond because they have the troops on the border, they have the planes in the air and the ships at the sea. The US really doesn't have any forces up along the demilitarized zone that would respond, and the responsibility for self-defense and defending South Korea today during armistice is a South Korean-led responsibility. Combined Forces Command doesn't become responsible until both presidents of the Republic of Korea and the United States decide we're about to go to war, and then all the troops from the United States and the Republic of Korea are then put under the operational control of the Combined Forces Command commander. So the provocation and the escalation that you talked about, I think is real. And it's real because that any sort of attack on South Korea will be responded to very, very quickly. And you could see how that escalation could grow very quickly because that North Korea has got a plan. If South Korea strikes back, here's what's going to come next. So what you try to do is work through diplomatically to be able to very quickly get the word across. Okay, you did this, we're doing this. This better not go any further, but we're prepared in case it does. So the fear of escalation is very real because I think it could happen. But at the same time, people understanding the quick response and the escalatory way that this could come from both sides, from both the North and the South, I think has been a great deterrent value because there really hasn't been a major provocation. I mean, we came close in 2015 a little bit, but there hasn't been a major kinetic provocation since 2010 that struck on South Korea. There's been a lot of missile tests, there's been a lot of nuclear tests. Those are all real provocations. But to get at the escalatory thing that you're talking about, I think North Korea has been deterred because of both the plans and the complete understanding that the response, there's not going to be any time the response is coming back very, very quickly from South Korea.
You know, I think just to add a little more color to this, I think you have to ask yourself 3 questions. One, does North Korea believe that all options are on the table? And everything that they've tried over the years has taught them that not really. That when it comes to the probability of the US taking kinetic action, whether it's unilateral or especially if it's multilateral, that it is reluctant to do so. And that gives North Korea a lot of room for adventurism, military adventurism. And that's sort of what we saw in 2017 and 2015 and 2010. And it is curious now whether, you know, what we saw in 2017 is again, North Korea did not believe that there would be kinetic action for hyper provocative actions, and they proved to be right. Their assumptions proved to be right in that case. Will it continue to hold true? It's really unclear. So the second question you have to ask is, does South Korea believe that all options are on the table? And I think that's a harder case to make. While there isn't a lot of agreement or consensus inside South Korea as to what to do about North Korea, there is sort of a sentiment that North Korea's nuclear weapons program is bad, but it's not bad enough to go to war over. And you would need to have consensus between the US and South Korea to make that happen. The third factor is China. Does China believe this is worth going to war over? And the Chinese have been very clear on their position. If North Korea starts it, they'll stay out of it. If the US starts it, if South Korea starts it, it is their obligation to help defend. And so then, you know, this is part of the calculations that go into what would military actions against North Korea cause? What would that escalatory cycle be? And that cost ends up being very high. And I think even on now, though, in the situation we saw recently, we haven't had a death of a South Korean since 2010 by North Korean hands. And now we have the recent fisheries official who supposedly tried to defect to North Korea, who was supposedly shot and killed at sea. But I think you also saw very quickly Kim Jong-un issue an apology, a rare apology, admitting this was not anything that was intended to happen. It was, you know, a miscommunication along the way. It wasn't his decision. They didn't plan to do this. And I think it was very clear that they are not in a position where they want to have any ambiguity about conflict. No, you know, keep tensions low, keep the situation calm, especially when they're dealing with so many things domestically already that we've discussed previously.
Yeah, I would agree that the, you know, you almost have to look at this, I think, from a conventional provocation. And what I mean by conventional is non-nuclear provocation. And again, I still believe that an attack in South Korea that endangers people or kills people in South Korea is going to be responded to very, very quickly and has a possibility of escalating it. But if you look at the nuclear side, it is a tougher problem. It is really a tough problem. But I still believe that a couple of years ago, there was all kinds of discussion. Will North Korea do another ICBM test and test a re-entry vehicle and potentially even do an air test like we did many, many decades ago with our nuclear capability? Would you do that? And you know, there's people that believe that at the time that Kim Jong-un believed that in order to really prove to the world that he has the capability to put a nuclear weapon anywhere, he has to do that, because he really hasn't proven a re-entry vehicle to the Senate. He has not done, you know, made it up a nuclear weapon and had it go off, you know, somewhere in the South China Sea or someplace like that, like we did many, many years ago. But you know, and I guess what I believe is if he ever did anything like that, that's a game changer. especially, even an ICBM that tests a reentry vehicle and all that. I think that changes the game somewhat, but obviously if you put a nuclear weapon on, even if it didn't kill anybody, but had that nuclear blast, that would really change something. And I also think it would change some of China's calculus as this goes forward too. So, again, you're talking provocations and escalation and how far he's going to push. I agree with you. I think he's focused on the economy right now. I guess the last point I'll make on this is I don't think he thinks, and he's probably right, that he needs to do any more real testing and proving of its nuclear capability, because the world's given him credit that he can do that. And I think he's seen that the world believes that he can do it anywhere, to the point where he then says, okay, this is a big enough deterrent value. I don't need to do this additional testing. We'll see probably some missiles and all that roll out in this parade that's going to happen here in another couple of weeks and everything. But whether he would then do, real tests and all that, I think would have to be really pushed to be able to do that.
Thank you. Very comprehensive responses on both counts. I wanted to turn to something that again was touched on, and that's the U.S.-South Korea alliance. And you mentioned, General Sharp, that South Korea actually shoulders most of the burden when it comes to their defense in terms of number of men and material on the peninsula. But the U.S. does have a not insignificant number of forces there. And the underlying mission of those forces is, as has been alluded to deter North Korea or defend South Korea in the case that deterrence fails and North Korea decides to engage in a conflict or invade South Korea. But this does really sound like an issue that's distant and over there. Why should Americans and folks in Pittsburgh, for example, care about what happens on the Korean Peninsula? And what, if any, is the larger value of the U.S.-South Korea alliance to U.S. interests? And what would we stand to lose if we didn't have this alliance or if it were severed?
Sorry about that. Yeah, there we go. So as you kind of talked a little bit about this in the opening, the introduction of just the importance of Korea economically, if you look at them, they're the 10th or 11th richest country GDP-wise in the world. Exports and imports that we share between the United States and the Republic of Korea. But if you look even more broadly than just South Korea, I mean, any sort of major conflict on the peninsula would very quickly, I believe, expand to Japan, China, and all of Northeast Asia. So if you just look at it from an economic perspective, in a crisis perspective, keeping peace and maintaining peace and deterring North Korea from starting a war in North Korea is hugely important from an economic and from a just a perspective of wanting to have peace and security. Also, we have a defense treaty with the Republic of Korea, so we are obligated to go and to help defend South Korea if North Korea is preparing for war, and we believe that are going to go to war. So I believe that our 28,500 troops that are currently stationed in South Korea and the alliance that helps build from a military perspective fits in just really well with helping to be able to maintain security and stability. And it lines up with what we do economically as an alliance, what we do diplomatically as an alliance. And you put all of those factors together, I think the deterrent value is very effective and very necessary. And if things changed and North Korea really did say, okay, no, we're going to try to reunify the peninsula again through force, that defense treaty and our troops over there would be, I think, continue to help to deter that, but they would be absolutely necessary if we were to go to war. Now, keep in mind, the 28,000 troops over there would be a very small percentage of the troops that if we really were going to go to an all-out conflict, we would send over there. The troops that we have over there right now function for a couple purposes. Number one is they're over there to help, and I'll just go from the beginning of the conflict type of thing where we see escalation starting to ramp up. They're there to be able to help to get US service, U.S. family members, U.S. businessmen out of Korea. There's a large number, a non-combatant evacuation to get them out. So their forces are there for that. We have a very sizable artillery force as part of those 28,500, and a fairly sizable force on the Air Force side to be able to help very quickly to be able to go and destroy the North Korean artillery, which is the largest artillery force in the world. It's positioned right on the border between North Korea and South Korea. Seoul, the largest city in South Korea of over 24 million people, half the population of South Korea is within artillery range of North Korea. And you're talking hundreds of thousands of rounds that could be fired without North Korea having to move one single weapon because of their current locations and all. So the ability to be able to quickly strike and destroy that North Korean artillery is paramount, again, at the beginning of any sorts of conflict. There'd still be huge damage in South Korea, but we'd be able to get at that very quickly. So we really focus also on making sure from a quick response perspective, the majority of the counterfire artillery would come from South Korea, but we've got great capability there also, both with the air forces and with artillery. And then the last piece that I'll mention in that, the 28,500 troops that we have there, is there's troops there that would help facilitate, bringing on board the additional troops that are coming from the United States, hundreds of thousands that would be coming from the United States, to be able to receive those, get those troops in and up to the battlefield very quickly. And then, of course, I guess really the last piece is the headquarters elements that we have there with Combined Forces Command, with 8th Army, with 2nd Infantry Division. All of that would then be able to bring more forces in if necessary that are there. And so I believe the troops that are there are necessary. I believe they've been very effective in helping to deter, and I'm very confident they would be very effective in bringing in the new troops and defending South Korea as if we had to go to conflict.
Since General Sharp gave a very comprehensive answer, I would just add a couple of points. One, the economic side of the story. If there is conflict, these are 5 of the world's largest economies, if you include the US as well, that if there's conflict and economic disruptions, it will have global impact. And I think we saw just a taste of this at the beginning of the pandemic. When China shut down, when South Korea shut down, the disruptions to supply chains was enormous. And that was a temporary couple of months. No infrastructure was ruined, even though there were, factories closed and things like that. It wasn't a devastation of the countries involved, but it was a small taste of what kind of economic impact conflict in that region would have. My other point would just be that, General Sharp talked a lot about the purpose to Korea of the troops in Korea, but it also fits into a larger strategy of US interests in Asia and securing US interests in Asia. So, we have interest in being in Korea and Japan and Guam and Australia and having troops around the region as well. To protect democracy, to protect a lot of our own economic interests in the region. So it's not just about them, but it does serve our broader interests as well.
Yep, I would agree with that. I've, huge believer in alliances, having served in several of them all around the world during my career, and the value of those to bring peace, security, human rights, freedom, democracy. And, South Korea is, I think, a great example of an alliance that has helped, bring that to the region and been with us around the world. Not many people, I think, realize that South Korea, sent a huge number of troops to Vietnam. When we were in Vietnam, they sent the 3rd largest contingent of troops to Iraq during the recent conflict in Iraq. They were in Afghanistan. They're currently off the coast of Somalia fighting pirates with us now. They've been historically and continue to be in many UN peacekeeping missions around the world. So they are a force that is very capable, but also they are a force that has been with us and helped us as we try to promote peace and security, stability economic freedom around the world. So it's a great alliance. And to your point about the whole region, I think that's exactly right. That's where we're trying to push for even a stronger, try to get a trilateral, if you will, working with the United States, South Korea, and Japan. And there's a lot of that's going on. It could greatly improve, but we all believe in the same values, the same value system, and to be able to help defend that value system and promote it, I think it's very important, and these alliances help do that.
Yeah, very comprehensive answers, and so comprehensive that I have to stay true to our schedule and turn to audience Q&A and unfortunately not get to some of the other questions I have lined up. Although we do have some questions that do overlap with some of the questions I wanted to ask, particularly when we think about sort of moving forward in the future. And it was something that was mentioned before. I think General Sharp, you talked about potential scenarios depending on what administration is in power in Washington. But our first question, this was sent by somebody who pre-registered ahead of time, is in either a second Trump administration or a new Biden administration, what would be the first sort of constructive steps the administration could or should take in 2021 to begin to improve US-North Korea relations, if anything?
So I guess I believe, and I'd be very interested to hear Jenny's thoughts on this, that the piece that has been, the pieces that have been missing in our strategy over the last decades is the whole information realm. And what I mean by that is to be able to continually to try to push to get information into North Korea, to try to have them, force them to be able to do changes, and not just in the nuclear program, but human rights and the way that they treat their folks there. So I would go very strongly in a new administration and say, hey, we're not going to attack. We're willing to be able to say, we've said this many, many times. We don't want to take your regime out or anything along those lines. But you've got to change as far as both the nuclear capability and the human rights. And getting that information into North Korea, then you got to back it with something. There have been several people. Vince Brooks, a former commander, is a prime example of, and I believe this would be a great program to think our way through, is get money that would really go to North Korea, put it in a bank somewhere, put it in the World Bank somewhere, that basically tells North Korea, okay, this amount of money, it's in there, we will help you and give you this money, but you got to do these following things. And have them then, do some, they can get some money to be able to go through. I think the pressure to be able to force North Korea to change from both a nuclear capability and a human rights perspective, you've got to somehow tie it to an economic push to be able to go forward. That we've said these in words, but we really, I don't think in the past have done, to make it so that North Korea would truly believe that it's there. So you got to somehow tie and make North Korea really believe, and not just understand, but believe that they're not going to be threatened regime-wise. And that could be a hard sell, but I understand that, and work it through information, but also help it through economics, but really make it economics that would be real, that they could get. And then letting the people know that this economy could rapidly improve if you were able to open up more. I mean, it's whether that would work or not with Kim Jong-un. I do believe he is young, and back to what I said earlier, is that I do believe he understands that for the long term. I mean, if he wants to be in power another 40 or 50 years, things are going to have to change economically. How long he can survive to have that slow change that Jenny talked about, and to be able to have that acceptable, I think is a question out there, and helping the people push, I think, is the way to go. That's not an overnight process, but it is a process that I think combine that with the strong deterrence and the other values that we've talked about in diplomacy and all, would be my recommendation, because I don't see other ways around it right now.
I think if we look at, for instance, the speech that Ambassador Kim Jong gave at the UN just yesterday as part of the UNGA, I think there's a lot for us to learn in that short statement that he gave. And a lot of it is a credibility factor. It's one thing to say, yes, we'll set up an account and eventually if you do these things, you'll get that. But as much as we mistrust North Korea, they also mistrust us. We need to find ways to build trust. And that is by starting small, creating the kinds of agreements, practical agreements that both sides can get quick wins on, and build confidence so that that proposition has some credibility. Because right now, the way the North Koreans look at it, even the current diplomatic process starting back in 2018, was North Korea feels that they did a lot of unilateral actions at the beginning of the process to try and create the right sentiment and environment for diplomacy to happen. But that the US actions, not the words, but the US actions did the opposite. They imposed more sanctions. They renewed the travel ban on US citizens going to North Korea. They withheld a lot of and blocked a lot of humanitarian assistance and workers going into North Korea. So the way that they look at it, there's continued buildup of military assets in South Korea as part of the negotiation process. So the way the North Koreans look at it is that the US actions don't instill confidence that this promise of a brighter future is really possible. They've seen agreements fall apart as far back as the agreed framework, unilaterally fall apart. They saw what happened to the Iran deal, where the US unilaterally pulled out despite the adherence to the Iran deal. And so, you know, the credibility right now just isn't there to make that leap. So it is a long-term process and it has to start with smaller practical moves to be able to test whether or not we can build trust with each other. And I think tactically, strategically, if a second Trump administration is there, they're going to need to find a way to message to the North Koreans that a different relationship is possible, that we do have a new proposition. We're not going to go back to working level talks with the same offer we made last year that the North Koreans have already rejected, but we need to find something that resonates with them to be able to test whether or not progress is really possible. And I think in terms of a Biden administration, one of the biggest tests is going to be how to prevent North Korea from testing the new administration. And so, you know, there are things that they can do if they can show that North Korea is a priority by ramping up the personnel, making sure that some of the first appointments are designating people as special envoy, designating who's going to be negotiating with North Korea, and then taking advantage of one of the avenues that Trump opened up, and that is the diplomatic letters to Kim Jong-un. So as long as we can communicate with him, I'm not saying rush into a summit meeting, but using the letters to communicate to him that, especially as General Sharp said, that we're not here for regime change. We're not here to threaten you. We do want to find a diplomatic solution to this problem, and we want to work with you for it, so that Kim Jong-un isn't guessing what will a Biden administration do, because their perception of it is going to be Obama or Biden administration is going to be like the Obama administration, and they didn't like strategic patience.
Right, I would agree that the only thing I would say is, I mean, this trust has got to work both ways. Our clear push has been focused on nuclear, and has been for a while. And yes, there's not been any long-range ICBM test, but his nuclear capability has continued to develop and grow. Without getting into classified things, we've all seen reports of Kim Jong-un continuing to develop nuclear weapons, continuing to develop capabilities, be able to deploy those nuclear weapons through ICBMs. Not that he shot, but to continue to develop, to build missiles and all of that. So we've got to figure out how do we work through, but I think both sides have got to be able to be true to their word. Kim Jong-un said he was going to denuclearize, and And that has not happened. I mean, just, you know, bringing down a cooling tower and knocking down one of the missile, you know, engine test facilities, while at the same time continuing to develop nuclear weapons, is I think what got us to where we are right now. So for a new administration, whether it's the same one again or a new administration coming in, be able to come in and do, I agree with you on, let's do step by step, but both sides have got to be able to do that and to be able to abide by what they have said that they're going to do. And the point I guess I'm trying to make is North Korea has not abided by what they said they were going to do in what I believe is what is the most important thing to us, which is our nuclear capability.
Just a quick word. I know, Jenny, you may have a response to that. We have gone live with, excuse me, one of our polling questions. So please respond to that so we can get a sense of how our audience feels about some of these issues. And Jenny, if you want to respond to what General Sharp said, we have some questions in the Q&A, but you're touching on some of the points that have been raised in those questions.
Just a quick couple follow-ups. Yes, North Korea needs to live up to their obligations, but the US does too. And there was things that North Korea was promised in the summits and in some of the working level processes that the US also didn't deliver. And again, the actions of the US while saying a different relationship is possible, all showed the opposite. Again, these were falling back to the old relationship. And so, you know, when we're talking about nuclear negotiations, Kim Jong-un didn't say he was going to denuclearize overnight. He did say he would work towards denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, and he's willing to do some of those steps as a phased process, but it doesn't start with putting their nukes on the table. So, you know, there's a lot that needs to happen in order to build the kind of relationship where North Korea can trust that if it disarms, that it's not going to be attacked, that at that point the US won't turn and move towards regime change. So I think, you know, there's a lot that still needs to be worked out. There's a lot of fundamental misunderstandings between the two sides that make summit diplomacy and summit driven negotiations a really bad approach to a very complicated problem.
Yeah, but I mean, as I said before, there's a difference between saying, okay, I'm not going to denuclearize immediately, but I'll work my way through that. While at the same time, the difference between that and what he actually did of continuing to increase his nuclear capability. It just held it as it was and then worked through some steps. I think we would have been much more willing to be able to move forward. But I think we're both saying the same thing. We got to work through some step-by-step things, I think, but they got to be abided by on both sides and agreed to. And you know, I'll just look at it from a North Korea perspective. What they've done in the nuclear regime, to say nothing about what they've continuing to do on the conventional side, which really haven't gotten into here, which is too bad because of the power of their conventional side to include, you know, their subs, their special operating forces, which are the largest in the world. And those capabilities, none of that has really changed, and it's also continued to improve. But I think we're agreeing that we got to work through how to be able to do this step by step, and hopefully a way that's verifiable and that's agreeable, and both sides really do go through it as we go through.
I wanted to quickly highlight the first question that we asked, excuse me, is for the upcoming presidential election, are the candidates' views on North Korea a factor influencing your vote? I thought this would be overwhelmingly no among our attendees. It's actually split pretty evenly down the middle, with yes winning out at 52% to 48 no. Maybe we have we've sort of self-selected an audience here of people who are interested in Korea, which skews the poll results. But I'm happy to see that result. At least somebody is paying attention. And we have a second poll question coming up as well, a multiple choice one. So please respond to that. Just to get to some of the Q&A questions, which unfortunately we won't be able to cover in their entirety. Maybe just I'll throw two out there. One of them, you were talking about denuclearization. Is this even possible? If somebody's asked, is denuclearization a realistic possibility at this point? And the second one, what is the state of Kim Jong-un's health? which is a constant question that we're fielding these days.
Jenny, you want to take the second one first? So, I mean, yes, denuclearization is possible. And you've got to hold that optimism out there that it's possible. There's no way, do I think, that we as the United States or South Korea or any other, freedom country, democratic country or anybody in the world should accept North Korea as a nuclear capability and just give up trying, be able to denuclearize them. That would be just too unstable and destabilizing. How do we get there? If we've talked about some of the ways, it's not an overnight process, but I still believe that I still hope that and believe that it is a doable thing that we got to continue to push towards. On Kim Jong-un's health, I mean, every couple of months, it seemed like over the last couple of years, people said, oh, he's had a heart attack, he's da-da-da. And then sure enough, we see him a couple of days later riding a horse or in a field or doing other things like this. So, I mean, he is obviously overweight, he's obviously smokes a lot, he obviously drinks a lot. And for a man his age, he's probably not in the best physical shape that you'd want to be in. But he still is, he is in total control. He's in total power in North Korea. And I believe that's where he is. How long will he live? What's his life expectancy? Who knows? But I don't see, an immediate health issue that I can point to right now. But then he's got much more background in that part of it, I think.
Well, I would start by saying, don't get your news about Kim Jong-un from TMZ. But I agree with General Sharp. He runs a number of risk factors, but a lot of times the rumors that he's in bad health are because he's not seen in public. And we've gotten really used to seeing him in public. And so sometimes people like to overinterpret when he's seen, when he isn't seen, what that might mean, and then imaginations run wild. Or rumors will start, and the last couple of rumors that he was dead came from a same single anonymous source in China. And why would they be the first to know who are these people? So I think, with everything North Korea, whenever you hear news about North Korea, you really need to ask yourself, who is the source? What is the source? How would they know that? And then if you can't answer any of those questions, I would dismiss it until you hear it from more credible sources. I think on is denuclearization a realistic goal, or is it possible? I agree with General Sharp. I think it's possible. You have to believe it's possible. And I think it's possible mainly because, the North Koreans still talk about denuclearization. Even the latest statement from Kim Yo-jong was that denuclearization is not possible right now. It wasn't a never, and they always talk about it in a very conditional way. So a country that really does intend to be a nuclear weapons country doesn't necessarily, tell their populace, like in 2019 in Kim Jong-un's New Year's speech, that they were committed to denuclearization. So as long as they're still talking about it, we should also still be talking about it and still be negotiating that, knowing though it's not going to come quick, it's not going to come free, and it's not going to come easily. The North Koreans are very shrewd negotiators, and they're not a conquered country. They have their own interests that they're going to carve out in that process, and we need to be willing to work with them if it's in our interest to reduce that threat.
Hey, Clint, if I could, I know we're about to end here. I just wanted to make one last point because I think it's very important for your listeners to understand that we talk a lot about the alliance and the importance of this alliance. And as I said, I've served in many places around the world in many alliances. And the way the South Korea people respect our troops, work with our troops, welcome us in South Korea, those 28,500 troops, understand I've never been anywhere in the world where a country treats the war veterans, treats the veterans that are there now, the defense that is there right now, better than South Korea. And we feel that, and we understand that this is a great alliance. I believe the strongest alliance the US has anywhere in the world. And you look at that from a diplomatic, from an economic, from especially from a military perspective. So as you look at, the people that are on here working through and understanding the importance of this alliance, it goes both ways. And that I think is very important to understand, and that this is a strong alliance both ways across, and a very important alliance both ways. Thanks.
Thank you, General Sharp. Thank you to both our speakers. I think you raised a really important sort of dynamic in those last responses. What are the costs and complexities of negotiating with North Korea, but what are the costs of not doing so, right? And I think the latter far overwhelm the former. And it appears with our poll results from our second question that most of our audience tends to agree that diplomacy should be sort of foremost an option. I want to just quickly pass things back over to Ivan from the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh for some closing remarks. But again, thank you, General Sharp, Jenny, my colleague, and KDVA as well for partnering with us, and of course, the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh. And sorry to those whose questions we didn't get to.
Thank you very much for joining us and for participating, and for our guest speakers. Please do not forget to fill out our survey that I share in the chat box. We would love to hear your feedback to get better and keep providing interesting events for you. And please stay tuned to our upcoming events that we're going to have in October. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Clint and Jenny. That was great. I really liked the way we were able to go back and forth. This was very well designed, so thank you.
Yeah, it was a great discussion. I wish we had more time.
Yeah. Me too. I was thinking the same thing. It was, we sort of went